Good evening. I'm thrilled to be here tonight, and I'm honored to introduce Valeria Luiselli, a writer and a champion for children. Valeria has lived in 8 countries, and she's only 34 years old. She was born in Mexico City, and at age 2, lived through the devastating earthquake that shook that city to its very core. She's been constantly on the move ever since, living in Costa Rica, South Korea, South Africa, and since 2011 in Harlem. Valeria wanted to be a dancer, but explained to me that this required more rhythm than she possesses. As a writer, she was a hit right out of the box and is one of Mexico's literary up-and-comers. Valeria's novel, Faces in the Crowd, won the LA Times Art Siebenbaum Award for first fiction. Her 2015 novel, The Story of My Teeth, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and one of the New York Times 100 Notable Books of 2015. It's about a Mexican security guard turned self-made auctioneer, a man nicknamed Highway. He bids on a set of teeth supposedly belonging to Marilyn Monroe, implants them in his own mouth to improve his lousy choppers, only to be drugged by his estranged son, who yanks the teeth out, leaving Highway toothless. The story asks us how much of an object's value is determined by stories we tell that give those objects meaning. Her latest, Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions, here it is, was described by the Texas Observer as the first must-read book of the Trump administration. I read it after reading Valeria's 3 other books, and I thought, wow, this is such a departure. But I was wrong. Her writing is about wandering, movement, being the other, having a foot in 2 worlds, belonging. Tell Me How It Ends began in 2015, when Valeria herself was trying to get a green card so she could stay in the United States. Her lawyer up and quit on her, explaining that she had to help represent immigrant children. There was a surge of unaccompanied immigrant children arriving at our southern border, children who were traveling alone, no parent by their side, from Central America coming to the US, fleeing the most dangerous places on this earth, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. Children in these countries are forced at ages 10 or 11 to join gangs or be killed for refusing to join. Girls are forced to be gang leaders' girlfriends. They come from countries with weak, corrupt governments. There's no place for them to turn for help, so they flee. Parents come to a gut-wrenching calculus. It's safer to send their child through a gauntlet of danger, coming up through Mexico, riding on top of freight trains, braving gangs, bandits, corrupt cops, kidnapping, sex trafficking, even ending up in clandestine graves, than have them face certain death if they stay at their doorstep at home. They are running less towards the American dream than away from that Central American nightmare, a nightmare that the U.S. has had no small role in helping to create. Valeria decided to do something, to be a volunteer interpreter for these children. Her job was to use 40 standardized questions to suss out the children's stories, to try and find a narrative so horrible that it would allow lawyers to present a case before an immigration judge that resulted in the child being granted asylum or some other means to be able to stay in the United States legally, rather than be ordered deported back to that danger that they had just fled. Valeria puts us in the shoes of these children, of a boy who witnessed his best friend gunned down right next to him in Honduras. Her book is compelling and a devastating summons to rethink who we are as a nation, how we treat the most vulnerable among us. I remember when this issue hit the top of the headlines 3 years ago. Maybe you remember that too. Valeria writes, in varying degrees, some papers and web pages announce the arrival of undocumented children like a biblical plague. Beware the locusts. They will cover the face of the ground so that it cannot be seen. These menacing, coffee-colored boys and girls with their obsidian hair and slanted eyes. I remember going that July to be on Meet the Press to Marietta, California, a place where Americans had surrounded buses they thought that were full of these immigrant children and hurled epithets and were spitting on these buses. Valeria is the child of parents who work for nonprofits. Her father came from a working-class family, but he became an influential intellectual, a politician focused on agricultural reforms in Mexico, and then a diplomat. Her mother went off to fight with Comandante Marcos in Chiapas, Mexico. A self-professed nerd, she decided to apply to go to school, to high school at a boarding school in India with United World College. And I understand that there are some students here tonight. She's thrilled to hear that there are some students here tonight with United World College in New Mexico. She studied political philosophy, and then she got a PhD in comparative literature at Columbia University. She writes some of her books in Spanish, some of them in English, a feat in of itself. She now teaches creative writing and literature at Hofstra University in Long Island. Like myself, Valeria came to this issue out of anger. President Obama in 2014 decided to make things tougher for kids, these children, coming alone, by creating so-called rocket dockets, putting kids' cases at the front of the courthouse queue, allowing them only 21 days to get a lawyer before their case actually began proceeding forward, versus a year that these kids had had before to get a lawyer. I made the difficult decision to move from being a journalist to being an advocate, to join a nonprofit called Kids in Need of Defense that has recruited about 25,000 pro bono lawyers to represent these children in immigration court. When I saw a 7-year-old boy in immigration court shaking like a leaf, standing before that immigration judge completely alone. 6 in 10 of these children still go to immigration court with no lawyer, no help by their side, alone. I've watched toddlers clutching teddy bears and children pee in their pants, toddlers, because they are expected to stand before that judge and mount their own asylum defense. Was my country asking a child to do that? I love this passage in Valeria's book. Perhaps the only way to grant any justice, were that even possible, is by hearing and recording these stories over and over again so that they come back, always, to haunt and shame us. Because being aware of what is happening in our era and choosing to do nothing about it has become acceptable. Because we cannot allow ourselves to go on normalizing horror and violence. Because we can all be held accountable if something happens under our noses and we don't dare even look. Thank you for looking, Valeria, and for asking all of us to look too. I present you Valeria Luiselli.
Hi, good night. Thank you, Sonia, for that beautiful and generous introduction. Thank you also for contextualizing the reading that I'm going to make tonight a little bit. Thank you all for being here. It's lovely to see so many. Well, I don't really see your faces right now, but I'll see them later. I see a lot of heads. As Sonia was saying, you might remember that in 2013 a crisis was declared. Now, this crisis was declared not on account of the situation that children were going through, but on account of what seemed like a sudden surge of arrivals of undocumented children that the detention centers, shelters, and the courts felt overwhelmed with. And you may remember that soon, and not for too long, this crisis made headlines, and that was fortunate, and I think possibly also not so fortunate, because that put a lot of pressure on the government. And what happened was what Sonia referred to a moment ago, with the Obama administration created the so-called priority docket, which meant the children were in the list of, were at the top of the list to be deported, and no longer had really time to find a lawyer to defend their case against deportation. So I ended up volunteering in immigration court in New York City, which is where I've been living for the past 10 years. I did so in a moment in which I myself had fallen out of immigration status, so I couldn't teach for almost a semester, like half of a semester. And so I dedicated that time to writing this book. I had previously not wanted to write this book because I felt that I didn't have enough clarity, emotional and intellectual, about the issue. I felt I was too angry to write properly about it. And I also didn't understand immigration law too well. So I had to do a lot of studying and being in court and a lot of thinking in order to put this together in a concise way. Now, the book is based on these 40 questions that we use in immigration court to screen children, and through which it can be determined if they are eligible or if their case is maybe strong enough for them to have a lawyer that then represents their case and hopefully wins it. And those 40 questions, in a way, offer an X-ray of immigration court itself, of the immigration system, as well as, of course, a glimpse into the lives of these children. So with no further ado, I'm going to read. I wanted to read for like 10 minutes, and they told me, no. Here in Santa Fe, we do listen, and we. So you said, are you sure I don't want to bore everybody? And they said, no. We've been doing this for ages. Don't change the tradition, and I'm very happy that I've been forced to read for a longer time. No one listens for more than 10 minutes. I'm glad you will. Why did you come to the United States? That's the first question on the intake questionnaire for unaccompanied child migrants. The questionnaire is used in the Federal Immigration Court in New York City, where I started working as a volunteer in 2015. My task there is a simple one. I interview children following the intake questionnaire and then translate their stories from Spanish to English. But nothing is ever that simple. I hear words spoken in the mouths of children, threaded in complex narratives. They are delivered with hesitance, sometimes distrust, always with fear. I have to transform them into written words, succinct sentences, and barren terms. The children's stories are always shuffled, stuttered, always shattered beyond the repair of a narrative order. The problem with trying to tell their story is that it has no beginning, no middle, and no end. When the intake interview with the child is over, I meet with lawyers to deliver and explain my transcription and occasional notes. The lawyers then analyze the child's responses, trying to come up with options for a viable defense against the child's deportation and the potential relief he or she is likely to get. The next step is to find legal representation. Once an attorney has agreed to take on a case, the real legal battle begins. If that battle is won, the child will obtain some form of immigration relief. If it is lost, they will receive a deportation order from a judge. I watch our own children sleep in the back seat of the car as we cross the George Washington Bridge into New Jersey. I glance back now and then from the co-pilot seat at my 10-year-old stepson visiting us from Mexico and my 5-year-old daughter. Behind the wheel, my husband concentrates on the road ahead. It is the summer of 2014. We are waiting for our green cards to be either granted or denied, and in the meantime, we decide to go on a family road trip. We will drive from Harlem, New York, to a town in Cochise County, Arizona, near the US-Mexico border. According to the slightly offensive parlance of US immigration law, for the 3 years or so that we had lived in New York, we had been non-resident aliens. That's the term used to describe anyone from outside the United States. Alien, whether or not they are residents. There are non-resident aliens, resident aliens, and even removable aliens that I know of. We wanted to become resident aliens, even though we knew what applying for green cards implied. The lawyers, the expenses, the many vaccinations and medical exams, the months of sustained uncertainty, the rather humiliating intermediate steps such as having to wait for an advanced parole document in order to be able to leave the country and be paroled back in like a criminal, as well as the legal prohibition against traveling abroad without losing immigration status before being granted advance parole. Despite all that, we decided to apply. When we finally sent out our applications, a few weeks before leaving for our road trip, we started feeling strange, somewhat out of place, a little circumspect, as if throwing that envelope in the blue mailbox on our street corner had changed something in us. We joked, somewhat frivolously, about the possible definitions of our new, now pending, migratory status. We were pending aliens, or maybe writers seeking status, or alien writers, or maybe just pending Mexicans. I suppose deeper down, we were simply asking ourselves, perhaps for the first time, the same question I now ask children at the beginning of each intake interview. Why did you come to the United States? We didn't have a clear answer. No one ever does. But the deed was done. We had filed our applications, and while we waited for an answer, we were not allowed to leave the country. So when summer arrived, we bought maps, rented a car, packed a few basics, made playlists, and left New York. The green card application is nothing like the intake questionnaire for undocumented minors. When you apply for a green card, you have to answer things like, do you intend to practice polygamy? And are you a member of the Communist Party? And have you ever knowingly committed a crime of moral turpitude? And although nothing can and should be taken lightly when you're in the fragile situation of asking for permission to live in a country that's not your own, there's something almost innocent in the green card application's preoccupations with and visions of the future and its possible threats, polyamorous debauchery, communism, weak morals. The green card questionnaire has a retro kind of candor, like the grainy Cold War films we watched on VHS. The intake questionnaire for undocumented children, on the other hand, reveals a colder, more cynical and brutal reality. It reads as if it were written in high definition. And as you make your way down its 40 questions, it's impossible not to feel that the world has become a much more fucked up place than anyone could have ever imagined. The process by which a child is asked questions during the intake interview is called screening, a term that is as cynical as it is appropriate. The child, a reel of footage, the translator, interpreter, an obsolete apparatus used to channel that footage. The legal system, like a screen, itself too worn out, too filthy and tattered to allow any clarity, any attention to detail. Stories often become generalized, distorted, appear out of focus. Before the formal screening begins, the person conducting it has to fill in basic biographical information, the child's name, age, and country of birth, the name of a sponsor in the United States, the people with whom he or she is living at the time, and a contact number and an address. All these details have to be written down at the very top of the questionnaire. A few spaces down, right before the first formal interview question, a line floats across the page, like an uncomfortable silence. Where is the child's mother? Where is the child's father? The interviewer has to write down whatever information the child can or will give to fill in those blanks. Those two empty spaces that look a bit like badly stitched wounds. Too often, the spaces remain blank. All the children come without their fathers and mothers, and many of them do not even know where their parents are. We're driving across Oklahoma in early July when we first hear about the wave of children arriving alone and undocumented at the border. On our long westbound drives, we begin to follow the story on the radio. It's a sad story that hits so close to home and yet seems completely unimaginable, almost unreal. Tens of thousands of children from Mexico and Central America have been detained at the border. Nothing is clear in the initial coverage of the situation, which soon becomes known more widely as an immigration crisis, though others will advocate for the more accurate term, refugee crisis. Those others, for example, are Sonia Nazario. She was, I think, the first to start calling the children arriving refugees in major newspapers. Questions, speculations, and opinions flash flood the news during the days that follow. Who are these children? What will happen to them? Where are the parents? Where will they go next? And why? Why did they come to the United States? Why did you come to the United States? I asked children in immigration court. Their answers vary, but they often point to a single pull factor, reunification, with a parent or another close relative who migrated to the US years earlier. Other times, the answers point to push factors, the unthinkable circumstances the children are fleeing. Extreme violence, persecution and coercion by gangs, mental and physical abuse, forced labor, neglect, abandonment. It is not even the American dream that they pursue, but rather the more modest aspiration to wake up from the nightmare into which they were born. Then come questions 2 in the intake questionnaire. Then comes question number 2 in the intake questionnaire. When did you enter the United States? Most children don't know the exact date. They smile and say, last year, or a few months ago, or simply, I don't know. They've fled their towns and cities. They've walked and swum and hidden and run and mounted freight trains and trucks. They've turned themselves into Border Patrol officers. They've come all this way looking for what exactly? The questionnaire doesn't make these other inquiries, but it does ask for precise details. When did you enter the United States? As we drive deeper into the country, following the enormous map I take from the glove box and study from time to time, the summer heat becomes drier, the light thinner and whiter, the roads more solitary. We start hunting down any available information about the undocumented children and the situation at the border. We collect local newspapers, which pile on the floor of our car in front of my co-pilot seat. We do constant, quick, online searches and tune in to the radio every time we can catch a signal. More questions, speculations, and opinions flood media coverage of the crisis. Some sources elaborate lucid and complex conjectures on the origin and possible causes of the sudden surge of arrivals of unaccompanied minors. Others denounce the inhumane conditions and systematic maltreatment the children must endure in detention facilities near the border. And a few others endorse the spontaneous civilian protests against them. A caption in a web publication explains an unsettling photograph of men and women waving their flags, banners, and rifles in the air. Protesters, some exercising their open carry rights, assemble outside the Wolverine Center in Vassar, Michigan, that would house illegal juveniles to show their dismay for the situation. In another photograph that we find on the web, an elderly couple holds signs saying, "Illegal is a crime," and "Return to senders." They are sitting on beach chairs, wearing sunglasses. A caption explains, Thelma and Dawn Christie of Tucson demonstrate against the arrival of undocumented immigrants in Oracle, Arizona, July 15, 2014. I zoom in on their faces and wonder, what passed through the minds of Thelma and Dawn Christie when they prepared their protest signs? Did they pencil in protest against illegal immigrants on their calendars, right next to Mass and just before bingo? What were they thinking when they put their beach chairs inside their trunk? And what did they talk about as they drove the 40 miles or so north toward the protest in Oracle? In varying degrees, some papers and web pages announce the arrival of undocumented children like a biblical plague. Beware the locusts. They will cover the face of the ground so that it cannot be seen. These menacing, coffee-colored boys and girls with their obsidian hair and slant eyes. They will fall from the skies, on our cars, on our green lawns, on our heads, on our schools, on our Sundays. They will make a racket. They will bring their chaos, their sickness, their dirt, their brownness. They will cloud the pretty views. They will fill the future with bad omens. They will fill our tongues with barbarisms. And if they are allowed to stay here, they will eventually reproduce. We wonder if the reactions would be different were all these children of a lighter color, of better, purer breeds and nationalities. Would they be treated more like people, more like children? We read the papers, listen to the radio, see photographs, and wonder. In a diner near Roswell, New Mexico, we overhear a conversation between a waitress and a customer. As she refills his coffee, she tells him that hundreds of migrant kids will be put on private planes, rumored to have been funded by a patriotic millionaire, and deported that same day back to Honduras or Mexico or somewhere. The planes full of alien children will leave from an airport not far from the famous UFO museum, the one our children have been set on visiting. The term alien, which only a few weeks ago made us laugh and speculate, which we had been passing around the car as an inside family joke, is suddenly shown to us under a bleaker light. It's strange how concepts can erode so easily, how words we once used lightly can alchemize abruptly into something toxic. The next day, driving out of Roswell, we look for news on what happened with those deportees. We find no details of the exact circumstances under which they were deported or how many there were, and if it's true that a local millionaire financed their removal. We do, however, come across these lines in a Reuters report that read like the beginning of a cruel, absurdist story. Looking happy, the deported children exited the airport on the overcast and sweltering afternoon. One by one, they filed into a bus, playing with balloons they had been given. We dwell for a while on the adjective happy and the strangely meticulous description of the local weather in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, an overcast and sweltering afternoon. But what we really cannot stop reproducing somewhere in the dark back of our minds is the uncanny image of the children holding those balloons. In our long drives, to fill the empty hours, we sometimes tell our children stories about the all-American Southwest, back when it used to be part of Mexico. I tell them about St. Patrick's Battalion, the group of Irish Catholic soldiers who joined the U.S. Army as cannon fodder during the Mexican-American War, which in Mexico, by the way, is not called the Mexican-American War, but the American invasion, of course. Very different ways of telling history, right? During the Mexican-American War, but later changed sides to fight along with the Mexicans. I tell them about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed after that war, in which Mexico lost half its territory to the United States. Their father tells them about President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, approved by Congress in 1830, and explains how it brutally exiled Native Americans to reservations. He tells them about Geronimo, Cochise, Mangas Coloradas, and the other Chiricahua Apaches, the last inhabitants of a continent to surrender to the White Eyes after years of battle against both the U.S. Bluecoats and the Mexican Army. Those last Chiricahuas resisted for many more years after the Indian Removal Act passed. They finally surrendered in 1886 and were removed to the San Carlos Reservation in southern Arizona, toward which we are now driving. It's curious, or perhaps just sinister, that the word removal is still used to refer to the deportation of illegal immigrants, those bronzed barbarians who threaten the white peace and superior values of the land of the free. When we run out of stories to tell the children, we fall silent and look out at the unbroken line of the highway, perhaps trying to put together the many pieces of the story, this unimaginable story unfolding just outside the small and protected world of our rented car. Though all of it resists a rational explanation, we talk it over and consider its many angles. We try to answer our own children's questions about the situation as best as we can, but we don't do very well. How do you explain any of this to your own children? The third and fourth questions on the intake questionnaire are ones that our children too ask many times, though in their own words. With whom did you travel to this country? And did you travel with anyone you knew? All children travel with a paid coyote. Some of them travel also with siblings, cousins, and friends. Sometimes, when our children fall asleep, I look back at them or hear them breathe and wonder if they would survive in the hands of coyotes, and what would happen to them if they were deposited at the US border, left either on their own or in the custody of Border Patrol officers. Were they to find themselves alone, crossing borders and countries, would my own children survive? The fifth and sixth questions are, what countries did you pass through, and how did you travel here? To the first one, everyone always immediately answers Mexico, and some list also Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. To the question about how they traveled here, with a blend of pride and horror, most say, I came on La Bestia, which literally means the beast, and refers to the freight trains that cross Mexico, on top of which as many as 500,000 Central American migrants ride annually. There are no passenger services along the routes, so migrants have to ride atop the rail cars or in the recesses between them. Thousands have died or been gravely injured aboard La Bestia, either because of the frequent derailments of the old freight trains or because people fall off during the night. The most minor oversight can be fatal. Some compare La Bestia to a demon, others to a kind of vacuum that sucks distracted riders down into its metal entrails. And when the train itself is not the threat, it's the smugglers, the thieves, policemen, or soldiers who frequently threaten, blackmail, or attack people on board. There's a saying about La Bestia, go in alive, come out a mummy. But despite the dangers, people continue to take the risk. Children certainly take the risk. Children do what their stomachs tell them to. They don't think twice when they have to chase a moving train. They run along with it, reach for any metal bar at hand, and fling themselves toward whichever half-stable surface they may land on. Children chase after life, even if that chase might end up killing them. Children run and flee. They have an instinct for survival, perhaps, that allows them to endure almost anything just to make it to the other side of horror, whatever may be waiting for them there. La Bestia's roots start either in the town of Tapachula in Chiapas or in Tenosique in Tabasco, both towns near the Mexico-Guatemala border. They slowly make their way up to the US-Mexico border, following either the eastern Gulf route to Reynosa, the border town near the southeasternmost tip of Texas, or the western route that leads either to Ciudad Juárez in Chihuahua or to Nogales in Sonora, which share borders with Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The journey atop La Bestia's freight trains ends at the US-Mexico border, and there begins another journey, one that is not as dangerous, objectively speaking, but is equally terrifying in the eyes of children. Once off La Bestia and having reached the border, the coyote's job is usually done, and the children are on their own. They try to turn themselves into the migra, or border patrol, as soon as possible. They know it's their best bet to be formally detained by border patrol officers. Crossing the desert beyond the border alone is too dangerous, if not impossible. They also know that if they are not caught at this point, or if they don't surrender themselves to the law, it's unlikely that they will arrive to their final destination, the home of a relative in some city, usually far from the border. If the legal proceedings don't begin now, moreover, their fate will be to remain undocumented, like many of their parents or adult relatives already in the US. Life as an undocumented migrant is perhaps not worse than the life they are fleeing, but it's certainly not the life that anybody wants. So the children who cross the border into the desert try to stick to the busier roads and walk openly along highways until someone, hopefully an officer and not a vigilante, sees them. I remember a teenager who, during an interview in court, told me of his increasing desperation when, after hours of walking the arid plains of southern New Mexico, the Border Patrol still hadn't appeared. It was not until his second day of walking in the desert under the burning sun that a vehicle finally appeared on the far horizon. He stood in the middle of the road, waving his arms, and when the vehicle pulled over beside him, to his immense relief, 2 tall officers stepped out and detained him. "My mom always told me I was born under a lucky star," he said when he finished his story. As soon as a child is in the custody of Border Patrol officials, he or she is placed in a detention center, commonly known as the hielera, or the icebox. The icebox derives its name from the fact that the children in it are under ICE custody, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The name also points out the fact that the detention centers along the border are a kind of enormous refrigerator for people, constantly blasted with gelid air, as if to ensure that the foreign meat does not go bad too quickly. Naturally, it must be harboring all sorts of deadly germs. The children are treated more like carriers of diseases than children. In July 2015, for example, the American Immigration Lawyers Association filed a complaint after learning that in a detention center in Dilley, Texas, 250 children were mistakenly given adult-strength hepatitis A vaccinations. The children became gravely ill and had to be hospitalized. By law, the maximum time a person can remain in the icebox is 72 hours, but children are often kept for longer, subject not only to the inhumane conditions and the frigid temperatures, but also to verbal and physical mistreatment. They sometimes have nowhere to lie down to sleep, are not allowed to use the bathrooms as frequently as they need to, and are always underfed. As we drive down from southwestern New Mexico toward Arizona, it becomes more and more difficult to ignore the uncomfortable irony of it. We're traveling in the direction opposite the children whose stories we're not following so closely. As we get closer to the border and begin taking back roads, we do not see a single migrant, child or adult. We see other things, though, that indicate their presence, past or future. Along the narrow dirt road in New Mexico that goes from a ghost town called Shakespeare to another town called Animas, we see a trail of flags that volunteer groups tie to trees or fences, indicating that there are tanks filled with water there for people to drink as they cross the desert. Occasionally, we're also overtaken by big pickup trucks, and it's hard not to imagine the men behind their steering wheels, big men with beards or shaved heads or abundant tattoos, vigilant, patriotic men who carry pistols and rifles by constitutional right and feel entitled to use them if they see a group of aliens walking in the desert. As we approach Animas, we also begin to see fleeting herds of Border Patrol cars, like ominous white stallions racing toward the horizon. We decide not to tell anyone in diners and gas stations that we're Mexican, just in case. but we're stopped a few times by Border Patrol officials and have to show our passports and display big smiles when we explain we're just riders and just on vacation. We have to confirm that yes, we are only riders, even if yes, we are also Mexican. Why are we there? And what are we riding? They always want to know. We're riding a Western, sir. That's what we tell them, that we're riding a Western. We also tell them we came to Arizona for the open skies and the silence and the emptiness. This second part, more true than the part about riding the Western, which is untrue. Handing back our passports, one official says sardonically, "So you come all the way down here for the inspiration?" We know better than to contradict anyone who carries a badge and a gun, so we just say, "Yes, sir." Because how do you explain that it's never inspiration that drives you to tell a story, but rather a combination of anger and clarity? How do you say, no, we don't find inspiration here, but we find a country that is as beautiful as it is broken, and we are somehow now part of it, so we are also broken with it, and feel ashamed, confused, and sometimes hopeless, and are trying to figure out how to do something about all that. We roll the windows up and keep driving. To distract ourselves from the aftertaste of the Border Patrol encounter, I look for a playlist and press shuffle. One song that often pops up is "Straight to Hell" by The Clash. We didn't suspect that that song would become a kind of leitmotif of our trip. Who would have known that a song partly about the post-Vietnam War Amerasian children and their exclusion from the American dream would become, 40 years later, a song about Central American children in the American nightmare? These icy lines give me belly sadness. In no man's land, there ain't no asylum here. King Solomon, he never lived round here. Question 7 on the questionnaire is, did anything happen on your trip to the US that scared you or hurt you? The children seldom give details of their experiences along the journey through Mexico upon a first screening. And it's not necessarily useful to push them for more information. What happens to them between their home countries and their arrival in the United States can't always help their defense before an immigration judge. So the question doesn't make up a substantial part of the interview. But as a Mexican, this is the question I feel most ashamed of. Because what happens to children during their journey through Mexico is always worse than what happens anywhere else. The numbers tell horror stories. Rapes, 80% of the women and girls who cross Mexico to get to the US border are raped on the way. The situation is so common that most of them take contraceptive precautions as they begin the journey north. Abductions. In 2011, the National Human Rights Commission in Mexico published a special report on immigrant abductions and kidnappings, revealing that the number of abduction victims between April and September, a period of just 6 months, was 11,300. Deaths and disappearances. Though it's impossible to establish an actual number, some sources estimate that since 2006, around 120 migrants have disappeared in their transit through Mexico. Beyond the terrifying but abstract statistics, many horror stories have recently tattooed themselves in the collective social conscience in Mexico. One specific story, though, became a turning point. On August 24th, 2010, the bodies of 72 Central and South American migrants were found, piled up in a mass grave at a ranch in San Fernando, Tamaulipas. Some had been tortured, and all had been shot in the back of the head. 3 migrants in the group had faked their deaths, and the wounded survived. They lived to tell the complete story. Members of the drug cartel Los Zetas had perpetrated the mass murder after the migrants had refused to work for them and did not have the means to pay a ransom. I remember the dark days in Mexico when this news broke out. Thousands or perhaps millions of people in front of newspapers radios and TV screens, all of them asking how, why, what did we do? Where did we go wrong as a society to make something like this possible? Even now, we don't know the answer. No one does. What we do know is that since then, hundreds of additional mass graves have been discovered. Every month, every week, they continue to be discovered. And even though the story of Los 72, the 72 men and women, girls and boys, all brutally murdered, changed the way in which both Mexican society and the rest of the world views the situation of migrants crossing Mexican territory, nothing has actually been done about it. There are, of course, some redeeming stories. There is a story about Las Patronas, the group of women in Veracruz, who years ago started throwing bottled water and food to the migrants aboard La Bestia, and are now a formal humanitarian group. There are also the many shelters that offer food and refuge to migrants as they travel through Mexico, the most well-known of which is the Hermanos en el Camino, run by Father Alejandro Solalinde. But these stories, small oases in the no man's land Mexico has become, are only exceptions. If anything, they are fleeting glints of hope in the dark and raucous nightmare where the metal wheels of La Bestia continually screech and howl. So when I have to ask children that seventh question, did anything happen to you on your trip to the US that scared or hurt you? All I want to do is cover my face and my ears and disappear. But I know better, or try to. I remind myself to swallow the rage, grief, and shame. Remind myself to just sit still and listen closely in case a child does happen to reveal a particular detail that can end up being key to his or her defense against deportation. I'm going to skip now to near the end of the book, but not the end. This is a final fragment I'm going to read. I guess one of the difficult to understand things of how immigration law works is that who gets to stay is often does not seem just. So if a child can tell a story in which they reveal that they are being persecuted by a gang and where maybe a friend of their friend or best friend has been assassinated next to them, or they are fleeing death threats, then maybe they have a case. But if kids are too young to be able to articulate a story, or if they are fleeing forms of abuse that they don't consider abuse because that's what they see as normal, or even if they're just fleeing to the United States because they want to reunite with their mother, then those kids often don't have enough for a case and often don't get to stay. Often my daughter asks me, so how does the story of those children end? I don't know how it ends, I usually say. My daughter often follows up on the story she half hears. There's one story that obsesses her, a story I only tell her in pieces and for which I have not yet been able to offer a real ending. It begins with two girls in the courtroom. They're 5 and 7 years old, and they're from a small village in Guatemala. Spanish is their second language, but the older girl speaks it well. We sit around the mahogany table in the room where the interviews take place, and their mother observes from one of the benches in the back. The little girl concentrates on her coloring book, a crayon in her right hand. The older one has her hands crossed as an adult might, and she answers my questions one by one. She's a little shy, but tries to be clear and precise in her answers, delivering all of them with a big smile, toothless here and there. Why did you come to the United States? I don't know. How did you travel here? A man brought us. A coyote? No, a man. Was he nice to you? Yes, he was nice, I think. And where did you cross the border? I don't know. Texas? Arizona? Yes, Texas, Arizona. I realize it's impossible. to go on with the interview. So I asked the lawyers to make an exception and allow the mother to meet with us, at least for a while. Parents are usually not allowed, well, they're not allowed to sit in, or relatives in the interviews, because their presence might modify the children's answers. We go back to question 1, and the mother responds for the girls, filling holes, explaining things, and also telling her own version of the story. When the younger of the 2 daughters turned 2, she decided to migrate north and left them in the care of their grandmother. She crossed 2 national borders with no documents. She wasn't detained by Border Patrol and managed to cross the desert with a group of people. After a few weeks, she arrived in Long Island, where she had a cousin. That's where she settled. Years passed, and the girls grew up. Years passed, and she remarried. She had another child. One day, she called her mother, the grandmother of the 2 girls, and told her that the time had come. She had saved enough money to bring the girls over. I don't know how the grandmother responded to the news of her granddaughter's imminent departure, but she noted the instructions down carefully and later explained them to the girls. In a few days, a man was going to come for them, a man who would help them get back to their mother. She told them that it would be a long trip, but that he would keep them safe. The man had taken many other girls from their village safely across the 2 borders to their mothers, and everything had gone well, so everything would go well this time too. The day before they left, their grandmother sewed a 10-digit telephone number on the colors of the dresses each girl would wear throughout the entire trip. It was a 10-digit number the girls had not been able to memorize, as hard as she tried to get them to. So she had decided to embroider it on their dresses and repeat over and over a single instruction. They should never take this dress off, not even to sleep. And as soon as they reached America, as soon as they met the first American policeman, they were to show the inside of the dress's collar to him. He would then dial the number and let them speak to their mother, and the rest would follow. The rest did follow. They made it to the border, were kept in custody in the Hielera for an indefinite time period. They didn't remember how many days, but they said that they were colder there than they had ever been in their whole lives. After that, they went to a shelter, and after a few weeks, they were put on a plane and flown to JFK, where their mother, baby brother, and stepfather were waiting for them. "That's it?" my daughter asks. "That's it," I tell her. "That's how it ends?" "Yes, that's how it ends." But of course it doesn't end there. That's just where it begins, with a court summons, a first notice to appear. Thank you very much.